The Bashri are known as famously ferocious warriors who painted their faces and bodies before they went into battle, and who used the Pelaisi to harness the dark magic of the spirits and fall into a raging frenzy. And while these tales are, though perhaps exaggerated, not false, they fail to paint a picture that does justice to the richness of Bashri culture. For the Bashrisé were much more. The Bashrisé were a tribal people from the south of Mendrine, who are now famous for the destruction of the old Achamidai realm, an event known as the Bashri invasion. Of the Achamidai themselves, not much is known. The old Sumer epics contain few records of them, for they despised them and refused them the honor to sing of them in their tales. What we know is that their culture was self-centered and aggressive. As the Kushumeri, they built monumental stone buildings for which they relied on slave work, so they raided the shores and the desert. In fact, the Bashri invasion may have been a coordinated response to this permanent threat. The Achamidai were the first to use chariots in warfare, which they used to push back who dared entering their territory. Not even the Kushumeri, who were the only realm to defeat them in open war, could hold their territory for long and had to retreat after a short reign. What marvel gave the Bashri the skill to defeat them, I know not. But they were famously good runners who often ambushed their enemies from the shadows and woods, feats that may have been of use against the armies of the Achamidai. I imagine the Achamidai trapped in their own cities of gold and plunder, a rather ironic end to their cruelty. The Bashri thus became the dominant group, not only in their homeland of old, but around the entire eastern and northern coast of the Achamtawe. They incorporated the original inhabitants into their new realm, even adapting to their way of society though, keeping their own worldview and customs. I imagine that for the common people of the Achamidai little changed under their new rulers, a stark contrast to their short period under the Kushumeri. We must imagine the Bashri realm as a strange dichotomy with many contrasts and contradictions, a loosely united community of tribes and villages in between the ruins of the Achamidai realm. Bashri society in the former Achamidai provinces continued to be tribal, but took over parts of the political organization left behind by the Achamidai, with their former cities as centers of power. The tribes continued to live in villages, and their chiefs went to the city to secure their tribe's position and alliances to other tribes, but eventually most of them would return home. The Achamidai thus remained the majority in the cities, and their language remained the realms, as Bashrisé had no writing system. Over time, some tribes became so-called city tribes, as they were open to influence of outside cultures. They lived in rivalry with more traditional tribes, but also formed a bridge between them and the new realm whose ruling elite they soon became. What we know as the Bashrisé were indeed a group of at least 7 different major chiefdoms, each falling into many different smaller tribes. Each was governed by a chieftain who had lived with his personal tribe for most of the time. It is important to know that the Bashri realm only incorporated the northern 5 chiefdoms, for the Kuningi and Luwewe had not joined the Bashri invasion and lived a life apart from their relatives in the north. Much of what the Bashri thought about the world and the Pelaisi has to do with what they called Kila. Kila is a difficult concept to describe as it permeated all aspects of Bashri society. We may translate it with force, spirit or vitality, but that does not do justice. Everything that lives, moves in Bashrisé, the word Kila was connected to descriptions of movement, has Kila. So do sun and moon and the natural forces. Those that have the strongest Kila should lead. We should not think of this as the right of the strongest, as many now claim about the Bashri and their successor cultures, for Kila was also connected to words of happiness and health. I think it rather meant that those were supposed to lead who had the virtues to ensure a healthy community. Some think of the symbols the Bashri warriors painted onto their bodies before battle when hearing the name Kila. In fact, the Bashri used these symbols, but for many purposes. They may be derived from paintings in caves that over long periods of time were turned into simple shapes that could be painted on house entrances and bodies, but we must not think of them as similar to Kushumeri symbols, for they were never developed into a script. They yet had meaning, though all symbols I know of stand for different aspects of Kila and simple imperatives, though these were also seen as modes of Kila. When a tribe member reached maturity, she would receive her Kila name, and it would be carved into her body with paint that would not wash away. Many of these symbols were meant to communicate with the spirits. The spirits were thought of as human-like in behavior, although banned from assuming physical form. They were thought to take revenge against this verdict by entering creatures and objects from time to time to infuse their wills and their anger into them. But they had to obey strict laws and could be interacted with by painting their symbols on things to allow them passage. For this reason, I believe they were seen as manifestations of Kila. It was believed that past ancestors with extraordinary will to live could remain in the world as spirits and be interacted with in the same way. When a person died, her Kila was thought to diffuse back into the world unless she held onto it. The spirits were strong but stubborn creatures, such as strong-willed former chiefs, and they were difficult to deal with, and to my surprise I found that it was customary to make fun of them, though always outside of ceremonies that involved their presence, where their wrath may have been triggered. When a great person died, her Kila name would be written on many things, and the person would be invited to a great feast to appease her and convince her to let go of the physical world. If bad omens followed in the days thereafter, the person was believed to have become a spirit. The Pelaisi, in fact, were believed to be pure Kila that manifested in the world when spirits were so strong with Kila that they entered the physical world. But since they were forbidden from passage, they would vanish and their pure Kila stayed behind. Being of pure Kila, the Pelaisi were like bridges between the world. They allowed to communicate directly with the spirits. These beliefs are intimately connected with the Bashri understanding of the world. According to them, the world was created by the great ancestors, spiritual beings that were so strong-willed that they created the different aspects of the physical world, though they vanished in the process and left all their children behind. These wept when they saw the empty, barren world, and were consoled by the Great Mother, who had stayed behind to take care of her children. Seeing her children weep and cry, she sacrificed herself and turned into a big egg, from which animals and humans were born. Many of her children would not be without their mother, so they followed suit and turned into the first Pelaisi. The Kila of all living beings combined was the Kila of the Great Mother, so their hearts were never closed for the spirits, and this is the reason they could be moved and influenced by them. This led to an interesting relationship between spirits and humans, since each were in a way the other's ancestors and children at the same time. So the spirits would not only be begged for mercy and gifts, but also consoled, nurtured, and scolded if necessary. Each chief had in his following shamans and dancers to perform a special ceremony called Kila at special occasions, which involved the tribe's Pelai. The Kila meant to invite the spirits had the effect of stirring up a crowd of people so that the Pelai would be filled with frenzy. The Bashri had a name for the state in which an individual felt moved to interact with the Pelai, and they thought the spirits would likewise be in this state, so that this emotional state was thought of as the purest form of Kila a human could experience, and as the spirit's way of being. There were different forms of Kila, so that there were children with Kila like the sea, and it was believed that an individual should respect their own Kila and that of others. Criminals, liars, braggarts offended the community's Kila and the natural world and could be exiled or killed. The Bashri had a strong but inflexible social bond among their communities. Every member of the tribe was called to find a function according to her Kila, but there was also supposed to be a place for everyone, and the Bashri made little difference between men and women in this respect. The Bachai epics famously tell of female-led tribes, though I believe they were not the norm and no queen is recorded, but female warriors are a common occurrence, and for what I know, Bashri culture praised the same virtues in women than in men. There was, as an important step in a member's life, a maturity ritual where one would not only receive one's Kila name, but therewith also one's role in the tribe and one's place in the community, which allowed the member to partake in the Kilawata. The Kilawata was an incredibly important factor, not only for a community's internal life, but also for its relationships with other tribes. This had to do much with how these gatherings were performed. The chiefs of the northern tribes were ever in rivalry and competed for kingship, which was determined through vote in an assembly of all tribes called Matowala. This assembly was a complex event that was part conquest, part negotiation, as each of the chieftains of the 5 major chiefdoms brought their personal tribe into it, and that meant they brought their spirits, their Pelai, and some of their kin that could be married as part of an agreement. The tribes then entertained a week-long celebration which involved different forms of negotiations and competitions, the specifics of which I'm not familiar with. But I know that there were 2 major rules, one negative and one positive. Firstly, who killed someone was banned with his tribe from the assembly, having forfeited his tribe's right to rule. And secondly, the chieftain designated to become king would not be crowned ere all chieftains had jointly touched his tribe's Pelai, ensuring that his community was strong and healthy enough to lead. This custom bore great consequences for the life of the tribes. Because a tribe's Kila would be held by its Pillai, and that would be accessed by members of other tribes in important gatherings, there was a burden on every individual to be strong, healthy, and proud, to not make the tribe look weak in front of others. Chiefs who wanted to raise their influence, on the other hand, needed to sustain a healthy community, and hiding its weakness by excluding tribe members from the Kilawata was a tremendous sacrilege. Bringing witnesses to such an act to a dispute could destroy a chief's reputation for good. Perhaps it was these strong social bonds that gave a band of tribes the power to topple one of the greatest realms of old, and to become immortal as great warriors in the tales of other cultures. But we must remind ourselves that the Bashrisé were a culture richer and more complex than this, and one can only imagine how it must have felt to feel an entire community's energy pulse in the moment of unity with the entirety of one's tribe and spiritual ancestors. What reverberated through the minds of Bashri warriors was thus much more than their ancestors' wrath. It was the heartbeat of their people.